Andrew Kirkman is the Peyton and Barber Professor of Music at the University of Birmingham. His books include Music and Musicians at the Collegiate Church of Saint-Omer, The Cultural Life of the Early Polyphonic Mass, The Three-Voice Mass in the Later 15th and Early 16th Centuries, and Banchois Studies, edited with Denis Slavin. He's also published on Shostakovich and David Bowie. He's made 14 recordings on the Hyperion label with the Banchois Consort, which have garnered most of the classical music industry prizes. He's also recorded as a violinist, including the premiere recordings of two sonatas by Cyril Scott. He's generously shared his slides today in the handout that you can reach from the link in the email that you received, which includes details of the manuscripts discussed and a short bibliography. So today he puts forward an interesting hypothesis about the later Alamire manuscripts. And so I'll turn over to Andrew. Off you go, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Meg. I'll just try and share my stuff now. Hopefully this will work. No, I know what I've got to do. Got to put it on. Yeah, just give me a second. There we are. Right. Now back to Zoom. If I've done this right. Here we are. How's that look?
Fine.
Okay, good. Okay. Now some of you here are, of course, very au fait with the Alamire manuscript corpus, but to others they might be a bit less familiar. So to start with, I'm going to just give a brief introduction to the manuscripts that we're going to be talking about today. The so-called Alamire manuscripts consist of a huge and impressive body of manuscripts copied over about the first 3 decades of the 16th century, and they're known collectively as the Alamire manuscripts because Petrus Alamire is the only scribe who's been clearly identified. As we'll explore today, they divide roughly into 2 big corpora. The first one, mostly associated with the Habsburg Burgundian patronage, consists of very, very grand volumes on parchment, often richly adorned with miniatures and border decorations, coats of arms, and other indications of ownership. The second group, on the other hand, is mostly on paper, and it's a lot more varied in quality and much less fancy in terms of initials and decorations, which are usually in watercolour. Now, the manuscripts transmit a huge amount of repertoire, mostly masses, but a few collections of motets, magnificats, and secular pieces come amongst their number as well, including the various fragments that have turned up. There's physical evidence of about 60 manuscripts in all. Now, voluminous though the series is, it's clear that from documentary evidence that even this is likely to be quite a tiny proportion of what once existed. Now, especially for those of us used to really scruffy-looking manuscripts like the Trent codices, the Alamire books strike really quite a stylish pose, really. And the traditional view of the Alamire manuscripts has been of a series of lavish presentation manuscripts, each one a kind of bespoke jewel box destined for a noble or at least a wealthy patron. And there's no doubt that that's precisely what the grander, mostly parchment ones are. And I'm going to turn to plate 1, the first plate here, which shows you the first opening of Royal HG7, something the likes of which probably I think even the former Prince Andrew would have been quite flattered to receive. Where I want to focus attention today, though, is on the less fancy end of the series on paper, some produced on commission for sure, but others, I'm going to suggest, more likely to be indicative of exchange through the more or less open market. And here's an example of that. This is from the Subiaco manuscript. Alan informs me he's been there and it's a beautiful place. I haven't been there yet, but it's on my bucket list. As you can see, this is quite an untidy looking thing. It's got some music scratched out and a very half-hearted correction put in there in this Kyrie that you're seeing. Beyond the insights that these more basic manuscripts can offer, though, what we can learn from them, I think, can shed some quite unexpected, really, light also on the production of their grander stablemates. Anyway, for now, let me direct you to the following plate, which gives a brief rundown of our main cast of characters for today. You should have those on the handout, hopefully, and so I don't want to go into them in a lot of detail. But at the top, you'll see the three manuscripts, Alamire manuscripts that are in Munich, that belong to the Wittelsbach court and Wilhelm IV. And then at the bottom of that group, I've put Munich 5, which we're going to come on to a little bit later, which isn't part of the corpus. And then you'll see three manuscripts from Vienna. The third of these is basically a very untidy volume of formerly a series of fascicles, each with a separate piece copied on them. We'll come on to that as well later. Then you'll see Subiaco underneath that, and then much more a grand friend, Royal HG7 at the bottom. Anyway, those are there if you need to sort of flip back and check what's going on as we work our way through. Okay. Now, the idea that there was a shift in emphasis in the case of the later codices isn't really in itself new. Herbert Kellman pointed out a long time ago that the divisions of the manuscripts into more or less self-contained groups. And then in the 80s, Flynn Warmington drew a clear distinction between two groups, on the one hand before and on the other after 1520, based, as I say, on scribal hands. In 1999, Stanley Borman proposed that use of paper suggests direct commissioning rather than diplomatic gifts, reasonably enough. The beginning of that is of a slippery slope on which I'm now joining him. And more recently, Zoe Saunders has put together a thorough rationale for division between an earlier group comprising mostly lavish presentation objects, many of them for members of the Habsburg Burgundian nobility, and one post about 1518 that suggests more commercial avenues of exchange. Group 1 consists mostly of very accurate and lavishly illuminated copies on parchment, while with group 2, as I've mentioned, we're looking mainly at less carefully copied repertoire on paper. There's the odd exception each way, but essentially there are exceptions that prove the rule. I'm not going to get into the extent of Alamire's ongoing role in production of the manuscripts, but as a general pattern, the same distinction seems to map pretty neatly onto a division in his own career between Habsburg Burgundian employment before 1517 and itinerancy in the years thereafter. The very different levels of quality control between the two groups give us, I think, useful indications about the expectations of the book's recipients. Zoe is shown in detail that preparation in Group 1 included matched positioning of leaves of staves on the two sides of folios, meticulously consistent margins, and bespoke layout for the shifting dimensions of the works that were to occupy the pages. And in contrast to that, the Group 2 manuscripts show a much more wholesale approach to page preparation, with blank staves and even whole blank ruled folios, missing initials and initials drawn right over unindented staves. Both groups of manuscripts show correction of errors after copying, but the process was clearly a lot less careful in the later group. And a few later codices, for example, Vienna 4809 and Vienna 48110, seem never to have benefited from that kind of attention at all, creating a smaller, but I think probably indicative subgroup that I'm going to come back to. Also, in the paper sources, we don't find many paper miniatures, escutcheons and border ornamentation. Decoration, if it's there at all, is typically watercolour grotesques and inked initials. Zoe also points out that the generally poorer quality of exemplars post-1517, with the implication that scribes no longer had access to the kind of material, the material of the level that they'd had to hand during the earlier court-oriented period. Now, I'll keep coming back to details about the physical makeup of the manuscripts, but my main emphasis today is going to be on the repertory that they contain, especially for any pointers it might offer towards either gift-giving or commerce. My first question is basic. Does the nature of the repertoire in the manuscripts suggest anything specific about its intended destination? I'll start with the issue of composer identities. There are, of course, prominent exceptions. The rich collection of the Fugger family of Augsburg bankers and their clear affinity to Josquin, offer a prime example, but generally, identification of composers, contrary to what we, with our composer-centric view, might tend to assume, seems not generally to have been a high priority. What clearly was important, though, was genre, a point that's perhaps most obviously made by the Munich manuscript 34, with its exclusive focus on Salve Regina settings. Whatever the direct use, or otherwise, of this pristine source, it would at least seem to relate to the known currency of post-Compline Salve services, a natural and expected expression of the Catholic Munich court. The two other Munich manuscripts that we're going to look at, numbers 6 and 7, seem simply to comprise two series of current mass settings, 7 masses in each, by diverse authors. Basically, there's little in the three manuscripts to suggest anything more specific than high-quality French and Flemish models for a Bavarian court chapel keen to rival its illustrious imperial counterpart, something that, with its subsequent series of homegrown collections, it would go on to do. As Zoe pointed out, it seems odd, in one sense, to see such meticulous care over readings in lavish manuscripts intended as interdynastic gifts, rather than over less elegant sources that one might, at first blush, think more likely to have been actually sung from. Perhaps that greater care over the readings of grander sources was in anticipation of subsequent copying into more workaday manuscripts for practical use, or maybe it's just a facet of their deluxe status more generally. Whatever the case, the extent of and the scribal response to errors in the less fancy manuscript might, I propose, prompt questions about their exchange status that seem not to have been aired up to now. Were they, as is generally assumed, uniformly bespoke items produced in direct response to commission, or did they rather, in at least some cases anyway, comprise pre-prepared stock awaiting potential buyers? Now, in opening up that question, I want to draw attention, first of all, to the apparent distinction between Munich 6 and 34 on the one hand, and Munich 7 on the other. And Zoe points out that only Munich 6 and Munich 34 can be considered with certainty to have been prepared for Wilhelm of Bavaria, since they alone feature his arms. Yet a look at the arms in question suggests that any distinction connected to their presence or absence may well be illusory. The next slide shows the arms on folio 38 recto of Munich manuscript 6, and you can quickly see that it's an ill-fitting affair that visually erupts the first page here, or at least the first recto of the anonymous mass Miserere Mihi Domine, whose other 7 voices are ushered in by watercolour grotesques of a kind that we see widely on paper manuscripts in the later Alamire corpus. But still more curiously, the arms as things stand don't actually show up until the 7th ternion, or rather than, as we'd expect, ushering in the manuscript as a whole. Although it's clear, and as my respondents have pointed out, that the volume must have been bound in the workshop, the placing of a coat of arms this late in the manuscript would seem curious, to say the least, and I know we're going to return to this issue in our discussion. If we turn for now, though, to the sumptuous escutcheon that shares the first opening of Munich 34 with similar grotesques, we can see that it makes for a far more grandiose introduction to that manuscript. But again, as Stefan Gasch has pointed out, it looks pretty incongruous in situ, and one suspects that either or both of these markers of ownership were added at some point as afterthoughts. The opening initials of Munich 7, the mass collection that forms a companion to manuscript 6, consist entirely of grotesques of the same type. Perhaps the lack of an escutcheon here was an oversight, or perhaps it was seen as redundant because of the obvious connection with manuscript 6. Impressive illuminations like the one in Munich 34 would in any case have had to be farmed out to dedicated illuminators, an expense that's highly unlikely to have been sustained in the absence of a client. Whatever the nature of these coats of arms, I'd like to suggest that their presence is no more a guarantor of bespoke production than donor portraits that were attached in diptych fashion to depictions of such familiar images as the Madonna and Child. In both cases, the addition of a particularizing portrait could impose a state of ownership onto something that, however lovely in its own terms, was in origin routine. And I've included a series of plates here of rests on the flight into Egypt by David and allegedly Isenbrandt, certainly all from the David workshop. And you can see, I think, what I'm talking about pretty easily here. Okay, keep that one out of the picture for now. The oddity of the positioning of the escutcheon in Munich 6 is hammered home by the bizarre sequence of the source's opening gathering. What we find here, bizarrely, is a back-to-front copy of Mouton's sixth-voice credo, Mouton or Divitis' sixth-voice credo, preceding seriatim across the first two ternions from the last opening of the piece to the first. Also, weirdly, the Discussants, tenor and bassus are on the right-hand side of each opening rather than, as you'd normally expect, on the left. Martin Benter identified the source of the problem, pointing out that the two choirs in question comprise double sheets that were all glued together along the wrong edge. Setting that error in stone, the final verso of the second ternion carries the beginning of Baldwin's Mass from Pulcheres, which then duly proceeds in standard fashion across the succeeding folios. The only reasonable explanation for this is that the copyist of this mass can't have spotted the copying anomaly in the credo. In fact, he probably wouldn't have needed to because it was already a separate section, as we're going to discuss later, but we'll come back to that point in a bit more detail at the end of the discussion, I think. I don't think it's as surprising as one might imagine to see this, though. The last opening of the second of the two ternions that's occupied by the credo is blank, and the scribe would simply have been aware of music on the two ternions supplied and proceeded with the copying of a new work, starting reasonably enough with the first blank verso that presented itself to him. Again, this depends on how we view the procedure of the copying, which we'll come back to later. But whatever the sequence of events, irregularity like this seems unimaginable, not just in the context of a gift, but even for a commission. What self-respecting magnate would feel recompensed for his investment by a manuscript opening with a work bound backwards and with acknowledgement of his nobility delayed until folio 38? The only reasonable explanation has to lie in the realm of supply and demand. Demand in the form of a desire for prestigious northern repertoire, and supply from a workshop, or at least a group of copyists, seeking to realise on its assets. As it happens, the support for this hypothesis in the relationship of Munich 6 to a source that's a good deal less elegant still. As Martin Benter pointed out, 3 of Munich 6's 7 mass compositions were copied into the modest paper manuscript MS5. I'm going to give you an example of that now. The trail left by those copies surely hints at the status and, more to the point, the purpose to its courtly owner of manuscript 6. The copies in manuscript 6 of 2 of the 3 masses shared with manuscript 5 show in their upper voices various augmentations and alterations in the underlay. You can see that here. While these might at first blush seem to hint at direct performance from manuscript 6, comparison with the readings of manuscript 5 quickly reveals that they were in fact guides for copying. And you can see this, for example, if you take a look here, that shows folios. This here is folio 69 verso of manuscript 6 on the left. It's a page from the credo of the Missa du Bon du Coeur, a mass that Bernie Nelson subscribed to Baldwin. And here you can see that the main scribe's salutem has been crossed out and et propter nostram written above. And right after that, you'll notice that salutem has been added by the same hand under the descending scale that follows. Now, if you glance to the right, you can see the same spot in manuscript 5 with the underlay modifications in manuscript 6 dutifully reproduced. Give you a moment to get an eyeful of that. Similar underlay changes in most of the manuscript's other masses tell us what must surely be one side of the same story. Manuscript 6 was useful and very likely acquired directly for its musical contents, which were expected to be copied on. There must at one time have been other copies besides those that survive today, because there are notes for copying at the bottoms of some pages whose indications are different from what we actually see in manuscript 5. Now, given that use of manuscript 6, it wouldn't have mattered that the first piece appeared back to front, its last opening succeeded in consistent reverse order by the others, or that its coat of arms was hidden away on folio 38, or even for that matter, whether it was there at all. The manuscript was desirable purely for what it encoded, musical raw material to be sung from unpretentious copies produced for eyes no more elevated than those of its sounding interpreters. A record discovered by Franz Kundler in Freising hints at a similar procedure involving this companion Alamire volume, Munich Codex 7. An account book of the Bishop of Freising from 1520 assigns Trinkgeld for the gift from the cantor of Wilhelm IV of a mass on Salve Sancta Parens. Now, as Franz points out, Munich 7 includes exactly such a mass by Antoine de Févan, which therefore seems very likely to have generated the copy in question. And we can see a similar process in action in the case of the compilation of disparate fascicles that today makes up Vienna 11883, albeit in this instance starting from, as opposed to ending with, copies at the scruffier end of the spectrum. Michael Friebel has identified the direct copying relationship between the Vienna reading of the Missa la plus gorgeous du monde by Hieronymus Winters, presumably Winders, and a copy in the post-Alamire source Montserrat M771. Besides the almost exact identity of the two readings, the connection's obvious from the fact that whenever a page turn occurs in Montserrat that's not present in Vienna, it's indicated in the corresponding spots in Vienna by a stroke or by a signum, and I've put little boxes around two strokes on this page to show you what I'm talking about. So, the same purpose can quickly be deduced from the similar indications of signa that synchronize moments across voices in various other masses in the same collection. And in fact, Friebel points out that there are examples in various Alamire codices of copies following exactly the page turns indicated by signa in Vienna. What draws the threads together most satisfyingly in the present context, though, is the fact that the Winters Mass is specified on its opening recto in Vienna and also in the manuscript's opening list of context as per Alamire, clear indication that the Vienna copy was destined for copying by, or at least at the behest of, none other than our famous copying eminence grise. Besides illustrating the prevalence of a particular approach to manuscript copying, the scattering of indications like this across the copies in Vienna 11883 tells us, I think, something revealing also about the intended purpose of this particular manuscript, or at least of many of its component fascicles. They were fashioned not for performance, but as raw material for fair copies. Of course, the presentation even of the least showy of the Alamire manuscripts goes way beyond this basic level. But the question remains as to how many of these sources surviving today were really likely to have been produced for known patrons. I'll approach the question first from the more general viewpoint of the paper manuscripts of the later Alamire phase, where it most easily offers plausible answers. Getting from this present perspective to the nub of the matter, Zoe pointed out that 3 manuscripts that form one codicological group with Vienna 4810, namely Vienna 11778, Jena 21 and Subiaco 248, were prepared for unknown recipients and bear no sign of ownership. Might the 4 manuscripts whose intended recipient remains unknown have been copied without a particular patron in mind, to be presented when the need arose? My sense is that Zoe's on the money here, and indeed that we might push her observation a bit further and suggest that these sources made their way to their eventual owners not as gifts at all, but via commerce. One way to probe that question concerns manuscript errors, and especially the extent or otherwise of their subsequent correction. Zoe notes that post facto corrections were typically made by scribes different from the main copyists, a state of affairs that ought then to allow us to determine whether errors were in fact corrected or just left to stand. Absence of correction would add weight to the idea of general manuscript or general workshop production, with time and effort spent proofreading, awaiting the identification of a potential buyer. That interpretation would tally neatly with a view of Alamire post 1517 as an upmarket travelling salesman able to respond quickly to potential customers, and it would make sense in a situation following the demise of court-based patronage, keeping scribes occupied between potential sales and maintaining a general uniformity of product. The fact that uncorrected, or at least incompletely corrected sources do indeed survive has to say something about the buoyancy of the market, the expectations of their eventual buyers, and probably the extent of the scriptorium's, or at least the copyists' solvency at the point of their sale. This is all just supposition, of course. More susceptible to interpretation concerning the manuscript's circulation is the nature of the errors themselves, and it's to this that I'm going to turn now. One of the plainest sources, and by common consent, one of the weakest in terms of its reliability and level of completion, is one that we encountered briefly at the beginning, and that's Subiaco 248, a collection of 7 masses by Pierre de la Rue. In contrast to the rest of the Alamire complex, its left traces neither of a recipient nor of any history prior to arrival at its present home. Losses to the manuscript are most obvious and probably least surprising at its beginning and end. Opening and closing pages, and with them portions of the opening Kyrie and Last Sanctus and complete Last Agnus of the masses concerned, were lost at some point. Less expected, though, and I think more instructive, are omissions from its interior pages, particularly those involving Agnus Dei settings. In all except 2 cases, the Agnus settings uniformly lack their final recto, and as a consequence, the concluding bars of the contratenor and bassus up to Dona Nobis Parce. It's of course possible, though I'd say extremely unlikely, that the missing passages were in all 5 cases originally copied on the first recto of a following gathering that's since been lost. But I think a clue to what's really going on lies in the odd copying situation of the Missa O Gloriosa Domina. Like its companions, this runs continuously until its last opening, where the concluding bars of the superius and tenor, you can see them here, are faced by a blank page. But this isn't the end of the story. And here I'm going to show you on the next page where that story in fact ends. And here you can see on the recto of this opening, the missing music of Gloria, O Gloriosa Domina, Domina's final recto. It's actually facing not other voices from the same piece, but actually the endings of the Discussants and tenor of the Agnus of another mass altogether, the Missa Assumpta es Maria, on the last verso of the preceding gathering. Following this marooned ending of Gloriosa Domina on the opening recto, on this opening recto, the Missa Tu le Regrets commences directly on the same pages verso, excuse me. Now, I think the explanation's clear. O Gloriosa Domina had at some point been intended to segue directly to Tu le Regrets, but at some later stage, Assumpta es Maria, minus its last recto, intervened. And you can see this graphically on this plate here. So you can see that I've put in yellow the blank rectos that are followed by complete masses, and then at the bottom in red you can see the Ada Dona Nobis of O Gloriosa Domina, those 2 voices on the first recto, that's followed by Tu le Regrets, and separated by all of its companions, by another mass altogether, Assumpta es Maria. Okay, so what happened then? Each of these things, I think, was clearly copied as a separate fascicle, with the copying of the final recto remaining in limbo until it was decided what the following piece, which would start on the first verso of a new fascicle, was going to be. In the case of the Missa Cum Jucunditate, Puernatus, Ave Maria, and probably to les regrets, that decision was never made, and these masses were forever frozen, in this manuscript anyway, in a state of truncation. The likeliest scenario, it seems to me, is that the 7 masses of Subiaco were bound together around the time the workshop, or at least the scribes involved, was winding up operations, a point by which, one might easily imagine, lots of tailless and homeless copies of La Rue Masses could have been sold off for whatever prices they'd fetch. A story of that nature supported by the almost complete absence in Subiaco, even of inked initials, not to mention its wide range of errors, some including crude efforts at fixing them up, that were clearly made after the source's completion, and I showed you one of those at the beginning. While the fascicles that make up Subiaco were clearly designed for directly contiguous mass copying across gatherings, the masses copied in manuscripts related to it by size and use of paper are instead divided by blank openings. The 8 masses in Jena 21 uniformly occupy 2 gatherings apiece, with each mass preceded by a blank recto and succeeded by a blank verso, plus in 2 cases an extra blank page. We see similar passages, similar patterns in Vienna 4809 and 4810, as well as in Munich MS6 and 7. Given time, we could go into a lot more detail, but the general point's a simple one. Each of the related paper sources that I've been talking about was assembled from self-standing fascicles that might just as easily have been mixed and matched differently, whether within their present sources or across others of the same size and substance. The identity, with this group at least, of dimensions and layout was surely designed with precisely that kind of adaptability in mind. Even the purely Josquin collection, Vienna 4809, has nothing beyond the grotesques, monstrance, and fugger coat of arms of the first opening of the Miss Pangelingua to suggest anything bespoke. Ink initials are restricted to the first openings of each mass, and the complete absence in the rest of the source of dropped first letters of first words shows that the initials that conventionally occupy the empty space of pre-prepared indentations were never, in this case, expected to materialize. Satisfaction of requirements here and in Vienna 11778 presumably went no further than the assembly into book form of fascicles comprising Josquin masses. Whether these were sourced off the shelf or via outside commission, they obviously constitute a direct response of supply to demand. But perhaps it was always thus. While broad generalizations across 50-odd manuscripts prepared over more than 35 years would obviously be as rash as they would be unrepresentative, evidence for manuscript construction from self-sufficient fascicles compiled without apparent foreknowledge either of destiny or ownership extends back to the earliest phase of the Scribe B Alamire complex. On this point, Stanley Borman's observations have been especially to the point. As he states, evidence, where it can be demonstrated, of a change of recipient during the course of a manuscript's production seems to imply that much of a manuscript could be copied in preparation for a gift without the recipient being of any relevance to the copyists. In other words, the choice of repertory would have been generic rather than tailor-made for any particular individual. Borman draws attention to manuscripts of no less significance than Margaret of Austria's big chanson collection, Brussels 228, and the aforementioned London Royal HG7, as instances in which the first piece or group of pieces stands on a self-contained, separately prepared gathering. In other cases, including the other glorious song manuscript, the Bassevi Codex, he notes that it seems that the dedicatory piece was added later, on an opening that had been left for it and its decoration. Borman's comments on the parchment codex copied for the Amsterdam banker Pompeius Occo bring it very much in line with many of the manuscripts we've been looking at today. Like Munich 6 and 7, along with sundry others, this grand volume similarly comprises a series of masses that each occupy its own fascicle and are separated from its predecessor by a blank recto. Elsewhere, Borman sees likely evidence, as with the interpretation of Subiaco that I presented just now, of manuscript fascicles that were copied, never sent anywhere, and eventually used for some other purpose. Our friend Royal HG7 presents an instructive case. Whatever we think about the sequence of its preparation and the point of its shift away from dedication to Louis XII and Anne of Brittany and towards Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, there's nothing beyond the first gathering to suggest any particular recipient. And indeed, Bormann draws attention to Kelman's commentary to the effect that what follows seems to pertain more to the proclivities of Margaret of Austria than of either of the target royal couples. Following the three opening pieces and their obvious relevance to the English royal pair's desire for a son, the rest of the volume, as for sundry other Alamire manuscripts, offers a display of Habsburg Burgundian musical splendour befitting the interdynastic gift that the manuscript became. Whatever the prerequisites were seen to be, they obviously didn't include the identities of the composers. The pieces are uniformly anonymous, and the absence, in many cases, of concordances suggests that circulation in some instances was really quite localized. Kelman points out the recurring pattern in each of the first six fascicles of Marian motets, followed by one to Christ, or St. Christopher in the case of the sixth fascicle. The seventh fascicle, with its 5 settings of Dido's Lament, and the apparently more random selection in the closing fascicle 8 add nothing further in terms of obvious directedness to anywhere or anyone in particular. Kelman points out the uniformity of the organisation in 8 quaternions with no blank pages, and with the contents of each gathering beginning on the verso of the first folio and spilling out only onto the first recto of the next. That this very consistency can be illusory, however, is clear enough from what would have been precisely the same pattern in the case of the masses that now comprise Subiaco. As I pointed out earlier on, they lack their last recto simply because they never found a setting in a properly finished manuscript and were bundled together, tailless, as the volume they constitute today. Between them, these two manuscripts, while of dramatically different status, reveal the simple expedient that was all that was necessary to allow for the mixing and matchings of gatherings while avoiding blanks. What the layout of London Royal HE7 suggests in terms of production is little different, in other words, from what we can glean in the case of the later, more modest sources on paper, and probably no different from what we might anyway expect from the operating methods of a workshop or a combination of workshops seeking to respond efficiently and cost-effectively to shifting need. All that was needed for this kind of flexible manuscript production was commonality of size and substance. These conditions were met in the case of the group of paper sources now in Vienna, Jena, and Subiaco, and they operated similarly, as Bormann points out, across various books in parchment. Even Munich 34, its seamless run of salve settings making it unique in the surviving state of the Alamire corpus, was clearly one of sundry such collections in its period of production. And for general anthologies of mass settings, like Munich 6 and 7, or motets, like Royal HE7, an off-the-peg approach would usually suffice. That it also sufficed, in at least some cases, for clients from kings to dukes to bankers seems to be amply attested, both by the long-term success of the scriptorium and by the codicological evidence that it's left us. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for setting out a challenging hypothesis that will surely provoke lively discussion. We'll move on to our invited discussants. Zoe Saunders, much referred to in Andrew's paper, is an adjunct faculty member at the Sorbonne, where she teaches medieval and Renaissance music. She held a postdoc at the KU Leuven-Alamire Foundation prior to moving to France. Her research and publications have focused on early 16th century Franco-Flemish polyphony in its cultural context, especially the Alamire manuscripts, and on questions of anonymity. Thomas Schmidt is head of school and professor of music at the University of Manchester after holding posts in Heidelberg, Frankfurt, Bangor, and Huddersfield. His research focuses on music of the 15th and 16th centuries and the 19th century. Published work includes text music relationships in the Renaissance motet, the materiality of early music sources, and on Felix Mendelssohn. He led a major research project on the production and reading of music sources, 1480 to 1530, published in 2018, and he is an editor and the co-editor-in-chief of the new complete Mendelssohn edition. Zoe, I think you're going first.
Yes. Thank you, Andrew, for this fresh perspective. Before I get going, I'm going to share my screen because I have a few slides also. Is that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you for this valuable contribution to how we think about how and under what conditions these manuscripts were prepared. You've raised some intriguing issues here and addressed what have been, at least for me, questions for a long time. My first question, Andrew, has two parts, and it's regarding the coat of arms and potential personal meaning for Wilhelm IV. I'm intrigued by your assessment of Munich 6 and other later Alamire manuscripts as a general collection of repertoire to be owned and copied from, yet not necessarily prepared for a particular recipient. The arms indeed seem to have been added as an afterthought in this case. Even though the binding was done sloppily, it does not seem that the opening with a coat of arms was meant to open the manuscript, as we would expect and as is often the case. If we follow the gathering signatures present at the bottom of some folios, and here you can see the image on the left, a very small gathering signature at the bottom, and on the image at the bottom on the right, a slightly larger, it's a slightly more visible, less cropped off B5. If we follow the signatures, the out of order credo, and these are on that credo, is gathering B, and the mass where we have the coat of arms, gathering K, which lines up if we count turnians. So at least by the time the book was prepared for binding, the mass with the arms was not meant to come first. If the book was, as you say, desired purely for its raw material, why indeed include the arms at all? Do you have any ideas about at what point they may have been added?
You're muted, Andrew.
I'm unmuted now. Yeah. I wonder. Yeah, I think as you know, as I said, and as Stefan and others have pointed out, the escutcheon really doesn't make for a very good fit. It doesn't look like it was intended to be where it is today. The space that it occupies is clearly like the space opposite, which is occupied by a big watercolor grotesque. And I would imagine that when the thing was originally bound, that was what was expected to go there. Why on earth it was added at that point, I have no idea. It's one thing that actually attracted me, though, was an idea. Well, you're actually going to come on to talk about your comments about the 8-voice setting of it, which maybe I'll leave that for now. But it would be useful. Maybe you could sort of talk about that a bit, Zoe, because I know we've discussed that. And
Absolutely. So the arms appear, like you said earlier, at the beginning of an 8-voice polytextual canonic cantus firmus mass. And here is a slide that you've already seen with Andrew's presentation. The presence of a coat of arms here would seem to indicate that this mass had some special meaning to Wilhelm. An 8-voice mass at this time was, of course, exceptional. The mass is the only one to survive on the compline antiphon Miserere mihi Domine, though numerous polyphonic settings of the antiphon exist from the 15th to 17th centuries. Polyphonic settings of this antiphon played an important role in the English Reformation, and about 10 years ago I suggested that the Agnus Dei canon in Baldwin's Missa du Bon du Coeur, as it appears in Munich 6, may carry counter-Reformation symbolism. Do you have any ideas about some of the contents, at least, of Munich 6 being related to the Reformation, counter-Reformation, and thus indeed specific to Wilhelm IV's agenda? Or rather, do you surmise that the arms were just added once it was known where the fascicles were going?
Yeah, I guess to start with the last point first, I don't have anything to add to that. I've certainly read what you've written about, that suggestion, which seems really plausible to me. I don't know how we get any further with it without some specific archival record or something, which I don't know. I don't imagine that's going to turn up, but it certainly seems plausible enough to me. What I did really latch onto though was your point about it being an 8-voice mass and that being so unusual. And was this something special that Wilhelm wanted to get his hands on? And it reminded me of this 5-voice composition that was sent to Henry VIII in 1515. It's mentioned in Honey's unknown Alamire article. So this is just like one piece that was obviously of some particular importance, one assumes, or at least thought to be, and sent to Henry VIII. I wonder if this is something similar that we're seeing here. That this was a piece that was of particular interest to Wilhelm IV, but then at some point they thought, okay, he wants some more material and we'll bind all this stuff up and send these other things off to him as well. I mean, what's really funky here, of course, is that opening credo that's bound back to front. And I know that Thomas is going to have thoughts about this, but it is remarkable that each of those openings constitutes 2 folios that have been stuck together along the wrong edge. And I think I'm right in thinking, at least I mean, Thomas can illuminate this a little bit later, probably. Are all the other turnions in the volume, do they all consist of folios in plano? That would be interesting to know.
Yes, they do.
They do. The whole
It's
lot.
entirely of folios in plano, like the all these types of manuscripts.
Yeah. So the question then becomes, at what point was the copying done? Was it done on single sheets, as I think might be the implication of that, or was it done after the gatherings have been put together? That's something that we can probably come back to later. But yeah, that's the best I can offer really about the escutcheon as to where it stands in Munich 6. It's bizarre, and I've racked my brains and tried all sorts of, as fellows would say, fancy footwork to figure out what's going on here, and I can't really think of anything else plausible, especially as you both point out, since the volume was bound in its current state before it was sent off.
Yeah, it's a weird placement for it in the manuscript, but it's also, as you pointed out, weirdly placed on the page. And when you look at I didn't realize this until you were just presenting now, but in your slideshow, when you showed where the arms are in Munich 7, it looks more like it looks like a similar way of presenting it would have been more visually. It would have fit better in this manuscript too if it were in the square painted with it inside. It looks kind of like that space is almost made for that.
Yeah.
Something like
that. Yes, indeed.
My second question, I'm wondering if you have any ideas if the manuscripts were not prepared originally with Wilhelm in mind, how did he acquire them? When I listen to your assessment of the 4 related manuscripts, and especially Subiaco, I am convinced by the argument that they may well have been made of pre-copied fascicles. And I can now imagine them clearly stacked on shelves categorized by paper size and staff size. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how Munich 6 may have arrived at Wilhelm's court, and whether you think that during the 1520s, in the context of his growing musical establishment, that acquiring copies of this music would indeed have made sense. Do you think Senful may have brought them when he arrived in 1523, since he had been in Maximilian's chapel just a few years before?
Sure. Well, there are people here, not least Birgit, who are qualified than me to comment on that. But it certainly seems a plausible suggestion. There's an eminently reasonable idea, especially given Senful's role, whatever it was, in putting together the Liber Selectarum Cantionum of Grimm and Viersung just a few years earlier. So yes, I mean it certainly seems a reasonable suggestion to me. I hope that'll something we can expand on in the general discussion.
Do I have time for one more question, or should I save it?
Yes, one more.
Okay, I have one more. And that, similarly to how you described a group of manuscripts which are physically similar, I cannot help but thinking of physical similarities between Munich 6 and 7 and the 3 Den Bosch choir books, which were seemingly copied a bit later and ended up at the confraternity in Den Bosch in 1530 to 1531. They would seem to support your hypothesis that the Munich manuscripts, and I would add to that, I think, Montserrat 766, were assembled largely from material already available sometime during the 1520s. And again, I can see kind of in my mind as you're talking this commercial workshop that supplied medium and large manuscripts, where they had kind of one shelf of more medium-sized folios, Vienna, Subiaco, etc., and another with larger ones that would become Munich, Montserrat, and the three Sertogenbosch manuscripts, all ready to be assembled and sent off when a sale came through. And I would add to that that Munich 6 has two masses in common with those Den Bosch books, which brings up the question of dating to me. The Den Bosch books are generally accepted to correspond to accounts dated 1530 to 31, though they don't exactly correspond to the descriptions in the accounts. It seems likely that Munich 6, with such similar physical traits, would have been prepared around the same time. Do you think that the scribes may have copied much of the repertoire in all of these manuscripts and in other fascicles that may no longer exist in advance, and then assembled and delivered them once a book was ordered? So I guess my question is it feasible, following this model, that the fascicles that would then become this three Sertogenbosch books may have been copied before the confraternity ordered them from Alamire? Because that's one case where we have records of an order.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's eminently possible. And certainly from the construction of them, I can see where you're coming from, because they're all essentially fascicle manuscripts. They have blank terminal versos and blank terminal rectos as well. And in fact, I think in the first two cases, everyone's put together that way. In the third one, you've got motets copied across the blank openings, which kind of reminded me of Brussels 5557, where Bunois, of course, copied these motets, or at least we think he did. There are Bunois motets copied across those openings that are rendered blank by the same procedure. So yes, I mean, I think there's eminent reason to say that this is the same kind of thing going on.
Right. Is that it for the moment? You can come back in the general discussion, Zoe. Right, Thomas, over to you.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to embarrass myself by not getting the PowerPoint to work, but I'll see what I can do. Okay, give me 2 seconds.
Good.
Does that work? That's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it first time. So first of all, thank you so much. I mean, these manuscripts, they just keep on giving, don't they? I mean, every time sort of I look at them, every time I listen to somebody else looking at them, you just sort of come up with new questions, and you realize that we're really sort of, I mean, we're only part way along the way of actually understanding how this all works. I mean, my questions are mostly concerned with the physicality of the manuscripts, as you would expect. And the first one, it picks up partly on what Zoe also asked about, and that's about sort of the off-the-peg approach to manuscripts of pre-produced fascicles. And I can very easily see that for the repertoire that Alamire was particularly known for, sort of his brand, which is the masses, the polyphonic mass settings from the Habsburg-Burgundian court context, so La Rue in particular. And it would have made a really good business sense to have a ready supply of those ready to roll. And in fact, one could speculate on that kind of pre-produced approach even for the luxury manuscripts, because if you look at the pre-1518 large parchment manuscripts, very similar in size, very similar in sort of production method, and also very similar in terms of the fact that the decorative apparatus came later. So if you look at, for example, I mean, this is, you have on the left-hand side, this is from Mechelen, and on the right-hand side, this is from one of the latter fascicles of Munich 6. So, but when you see the basic copying of the mass is no different. You have the indentation of the three systems on the top, and then so the only difference of Mechelen is that somebody later, the illuminator, took this and made it meaningful by adding the illumination and by sort of creating the reference to the mass. But the actual Kyrie, the actual music of the Mass could have been easily pre-produced as well. So there's possibly even a commonality that goes beyond the paper manuscripts. My question is really about the repertoires that are more specific. Did Alamire not only have a whole pile of Leroux masses sitting on the shelf, but also did he have a whole pile of Josquin masses sitting on the shelf? And Josquin wasn't a thing in the he wasn't a major player in this repertoire. So would have made sense for Alamire to have a pile of Josquin sitting there, just on the off chance that Fugger came along, who was sort of a Josquin nut, that he may have wanted that. And the same with the Salve Regina manuscript. It's a very unusual format. It is, yes, there will have been more Salve Regina manuscripts, but it was still something far less common. So do you produce a Salve Regina manuscript just on spec? So somebody comes along and wants it? I wonder whether again, whether it's the mixture of approaches here rather than one. So that partly it may be commissioned and partly it may be pre-produced.
Yeah. Well, I think to start with, I'd say, as I said in the paper, I think there's probably a big range of possibilities across this panoply of sources, and it would be idle to pretend that they were all made with the same kind of agenda in view, or non-agenda, as it was, as the case may be. I'm certainly with you on the idea that many of the luxury manuscripts could have been similarly prepared from pre-existing fascicles. As I pointed out with Royal HG7, there's nothing specific after the first gathering, and of course Bormann made that point more generally too. But I think one thing that we really have to keep in mind when we look at what survived is just what a comparatively small amount of it is compared with what once existed. Again, if we go back to to Honey's article on the unknown Alamire, that clearly what's gone vastly outnumbered what's survived. So, I mean, even with major collections like the 1602 inventory of Philip II's books, 234 books, music books listed, of which 13 have survived. And if we think about the Fugger collection, it was 78 volumes, of which we have 8 now or something, comparatively few. But regarding Josquin, as you say, Thomas, it certainly points away from the standard Habsburg Burgundian fare. But I think this might be a key shift, because it's precisely a heavy presence of Josquin that I think looks like a pointer away from Habsburg Burgundian emphasis and towards a more commercial angle. And let's remember again, Grimm and Viersung 1520, where the largest number of motets in that volume is by Josquin, and that's already in 1520, and in this kind of milieu, as it were. So Josquin's climbing pretty steeply by the time the Fuggers were acquiring him, and so I think there must have already by this stage been a fairly significant demand to supply to. On the other hand, of course, the Fuggers were bankrolling the Habsburgs, and they could well have been feeding their desire for Josquin as a result. Still, as I say, the Fugger collection, what we've got is still quite a tiny proportion of what there once was. Now, to go to the Salves, I think to start with, as we know from records, quite a number of other Alamire Salve volumes once existed. The Fugger inventory itself has a lost volume of Salve settings, also by diverse authors like the one that survives in Munich. And there's an inventory of manuscripts that were owned by Mary of Hungary, that were presumably from Margaret of Austria and inventoried under Philip II, that includes another one in folio grande, and salves by diverse authors. And also, I think what's probably more of a key thing here, and the main thing I want to say about it really, concerns the Confraternity of Our Lady in Antwerp, where clearly there were numerous copying records to that confraternity, including for a Virgo book and for 4 choirs of polyphony for the Lof. And I think the market for salve settings at this time must have been at least as wide as the currency of salve or Lof services, which means pretty much anybody who could afford to hold such services, probably running to hundreds of churches, chapels, cathedrals, collegiate churches across the Low Countries. But of course, these are precisely the places where volumes of polyphony were least likely to survive. And in that connection, I think we shouldn't forget that all that survives, even from Antwerp, is this kind of tiny handful of binding fragments. And just one final thing on that: Larue owned a daily salve. He endowed a daily salve in Kortrijk at Our Ladies. And since he also gave them 6 books of polyphony, it's hard to imagine that they didn't include at least some of his surviving salve settings, if not indeed some that haven't survived. And of course, there are 6 that survive to this day. So I guess that's my thoughts about the Josquin and Salve thing.
Okay, thank you. I mean, the second question is really about sort of how nice these books are. And I'm probably partly sort of for sort of rhetorical flourish, being quite dismissive of sort of that of the quality of them, that they're sort of more sort of workaday, that they're more kind of repository rather than something to sort of to cherish as an object. And I'm not sure I'm entirely with you on that. I mean, of course, they're not like Mechelen or Jena 4, but I mean, if we're just, I'm starting with a few images. These are this to the left, this is the Munich 6 binding, and to the right, this is the Occo binding, which also incidentally sort of demonstrates that, and Bent has shown that already in his catalogue, that Munich 6 and Munich 7 were bound in Flanders, so they arrived as the finished object. And I mean, this is sort of, it's not sort of grand, but it's fairly sort of reasonably nice stuff. And then when you look at the images, I mean, this is you got the watercolor images. I mean, the copying is actually very neat. I can't comment on sort of the error proneness of it, but I mean, that's not a book that you just sort of use, to me anyway, or wonder how the purpose of this can only have been, we just use it to copy out of, and then we sort of hide it somewhere. Because I mean, this is Vienna 1883, which is so the other book that you mentioned. I mean, that's a book you don't want to show that in company. I mean, that's literally just to use as a repository and stick on a shelf, and that's the end of it, and it's much smaller. So I mean, by the standards of 16th century polyphonic codices, I mean, even Munich 6, 7, and 34 are pretty nice books. So why would they have been so nice, so elaborate, and so ultimate, so at least reasonably beautiful and grand, if they were only there as a repository?
Well, I wouldn't kick them off my coffee table, I must admit, but I think one thing that's been gnawing at my mind with all of this is, why on earth did the Fuggers and the Wittelsbachs and so on accept paper manuscripts at all? Why didn't they have parchment? They could certainly afford it. I mean, the Fuggers could afford anything. They could afford to buy the Habsburgs, more or less, So why on earth didn't they go for something more grandiose? But and as you say, this looks a lot nicer than 11883. But it's hard to see that it was very much used. I don't know. Maybe Zoe can come back on that. I can't see much evidence of use for Munich 6. So what we do know anyway is that it shows little sign of use. At least that's what I'm seeing. And we also know that it definitely was used for generating new copies. That's demonstrable. We have the evidence of it. So yes, although this certainly looks a hell of a lot nicer than 11883, indeed pretty much anything does, it clearly was used for copies, and not just the ones that we've got. So and we come back to the question again: why would Wilhelm IV have accepted something that was such a dog's dinner, in the way it was put together? It's a mystery to me, unless it was just purely because he wanted that material. He wanted the quality of that music to be performed in his chapel, and that was really the main agenda, not the thing looking beautiful.
Actually, unless this question is going to be quick, Thomas, I'm going to suggest that you hold it until the general discussion, if you don't mind.
Since it's more or less a question than I'm still completely puzzled by that first sort of fascicle, and I think we can come back to that, but it's not sort of it's really not enough of a question, rather than sort of musings on what the hell is going on there, then we can leave that for later.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd just like to get in with one question, if I may, before opening up the floor to everybody. Andrew, how does your hypothesis relate to the wider availability of printed music by about 1517? Why would a purchaser want a ready-made, less elegant manuscript with repertory not of his choosing, when a wider choice of repertory was available in print? Was the scenario you suggest commercially competitive with print?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and it's certainly one that I've thought about. Um, I think, I mean, just thinking about the amount of, from a printer's point of view, the amount of work that's involved in pumping out a printed edition. You know, you need a great deal of equipment, and there's a lot of expense and overheads involved in doing it. So I can imagine that from the point of view, I know this is not quite your question, but I'll come back to that. From the point of view of the workshop, I can quite see that knocking out a few manuscripts by hand might well be have some commercial sense in a circumstance in which, you know, printing is a very expensive thing to get into. I suppose,
Especially in choir book format.
yeah, well, indeed. I mean, just look at Grimm and Viersung. I mean, look at the expense that must have been involved in that, and it's not typical, but you know, all the same. Yeah, I would imagine it must have something to do with the availability of repertoire, and you know just how accessible some of this material is. I haven't systematically gone through and looked at how much of this stuff was available in print by the 1520s. Maybe Thomas can comment on it. It's more likely to have that kind of information to hand, I suppose. But I suspect that a lot of this stuff wasn't yet available in print anyway, and possibly there was, if, in terms of the lines of transmission and the lines of interaction, going to a court setting and looking for material would probably be a natural thing for the Wittelsbachs to do. You know, look to the Habsburgs for or the Habsburg orbit for material to get hold of to get a repertoire together that could actually compete with what Wilhelm IV's uncle was enjoying. So that's not really a full answer to your question. I don't know if there is one, but
Well, somebody to think about, perhaps.
yeah, certainly.